Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to Lion-Faced Guru podcast. I'm your host. My name is Kim Katami, and today I'm interviewing an internet friend of mine, Lama John Hoag from Montana, United States. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. So nice to meet you finally, face to face.
Yeah. Maybe as an introduction, I would like to say that I've known about John maybe 6-7 years already. And it was back then when I was reading and writing on some Dharma-related, Buddhism-related Facebook groups. And I noticed that there is this person called John Hoag whose comments are always kind, always really down to earth, and always really open-minded. And then at some point, little later, we started changing messages over Messenger, and ever since have been talking about all kinds of things. And now we have come to a point when I felt like asking if I could do an interview with John. So here we are.
And you forgot to mention we've also exchanged some quite humorous jokes.
Right, that's right. Not to forget that. Yeah. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. How was your childhood and what early experiences led you to spiritual path?
Well, I can't say that I had any what I felt at the time were, kind of spiritual experiences in my childhood, but I always had a very clear sense of presence and, just who I was being there. And I always had a kind of very open sense of wonderment especially when I was walking outside. I just easily kind of fell into that. But I didn't really learn anything about Buddhism or any kind of spiritual path until I was about 15. So I, grew up half the time in Detroit, Michigan, which at that time was like a big, still vibrant, wealthy industrial center in the US, because in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was still the supreme time of the automotive industry in the US. They were selling millions and millions of cars and new models every year, and everyone wanted more and more fins on their autos. And then my mother had been from Montana, so every year for like about a third of the year, we'd go to Montana and spend in Montana. And especially we had a cabin that was up near in the mountains, and we'd go and stay there. So that was like heaven, especially compared with Detroit. But Detroit was still quite nice. But I remember one year, I think I was about 15 at high school. So at the school, they used to have a kind of a fair at the end of the year to raise money for the school. And they had a used book tent. So I went in the used tent, and there, I don't know how it got there, but right there in Detroit, Michigan, there was a book, a little paperback about all the great Zen masters from China, from, the golden age of Chinese Zen, from like the Tang Dynasty, Song Dynasty, Yuan Dynasty. So I picked that up for 25 cents And I took that home, and it had little, maybe 4 or 5 pages about each of the different masters. And it had a short biography of each one for a page or two. And then it had some translations of their teachings. And I read that and I said, wow, this is the greatest. This is for me.
Right. Yeah.
So I just put that like in my mind, and I used to take that book out all through high school and just open it up and read a couple pages every day. So that had a very, very somehow deep effect on me. And so I was thinking, ultimately, this is what I wanted to do. But, I went to college, university, and the university I went to, it didn't have anything about Asia. It didn't have any courses about Buddhism or any other kind of religions except basically Christianity. And didn't have any philosophy courses about Asian philosophy or anything. So I didn't study any of that in college. I just studied about medieval European, Renaissance European art and philosophy. And but it turned out to be quite strange, because after I left there, then some of the most famous professors, like Bob Thurmond, became professors there and started a big Buddhist studies program. And I think one of his students, Alan Wallace, who also went there later, he's also quite well known as a teacher now.
Sure, yeah.
So anyway, I was just about to graduate, and I had made up my mind I was either going to go to India or Japan after I graduated. I wasn't going to go to graduate school or do any of that. I was just going to take a few years, go to India or Japan, and learn about the different traditions and especially practice. So one day, I had no idea where I was going to go or what was going to happen. And one day I went into the administrative office, the dean's office at the college, and there was a big poster on the wall. The university was giving a fellowship to go to Japan. So I knew nothing about Japan except this was for me.
Right.
So I applied for the fellowship, and most fortunately, since nobody else knew anything about Japan either, I got it. So I went to Japan, and it turned out that where we were staying was in Kyoto. So I got to Kyoto, and it was at Doshisha University, the fellowship. And Doshisha is right across from one of the 5 main, it's right smack in the center of Kyoto, and it's right across from one of the 5 main Zen temples, which is Shokokuji. So I went over there. The next day, I got to Japan, and I met the head monk there, and he could speak just 2 or 3 words of English, but he was a very kind fellow. And he said, yeah, you can come and sit with us in the Zendo, but you have to behave yourself, no talking, no doing anything. Otherwise, you're going to not be allowed. I said, I'll be very well behaved. So every day I went over to Shokokuji and sat. And then actually, after I got this fellowship, I had a girlfriend, and she was at one of the colleges, Smith College, that's just very close to where I was going to school. And she kept urging me. She said, there's a professor there, and I went to one of his courses. He's a very nice Japanese professor, and he will I think he knows a lot about Zen and Buddhism. So why don't you go and have an interview with him? He's very open. He'd be happy to talk to you. So I said, okay, that sounds great. So she arranged for me to go and visit her professor there. And the professor was looking at me, was sort of like, here's. So I told him I got this fellowship to go to Japan, and I was going to go to Japan and learn and practice Zen. And so he's a little bit, he's heard this like 1,000 times already. And he said to me, do you know anything about Zen? I said, no, I don't know anything about Zen. I just read this one book that I've had since high school. And then he's sort of rolling his eyes a little bit. And then he said, well, don't you think it'd be a good idea if you went, before you went to Japan, to go and try it out a little bit and find out what it's like and practice? I said, certainly, that's great. And he said, well, since you're, leaving, since that time, all the flights to the Pacific, across the Pacific, would go from Los Angeles or San Francisco or those areas. There weren't a lot of direct flights in those days. So he said, I have this friend of mine. He's the head teacher, Roshi, at Zen Center outside of LA. He said, why don't you go there for, a few weeks or a month, and then see if you actually like it or not before you decide that you're actually going to be doing this.
Right. Yeah.
So, because he'd seen plenty of people before that were, I think, telling him the same thing. And then, they didn't last more than a day or two. So I said, certainly. So he set me up with this Roshi that was quite well known in LA at the Mount Baldy Zen Center. They had a center up on the top of this very high mountain just behind Los Angeles. So even though Los Angeles is right at sea level, this mountain is about 10,000 feet high. So it's up, 2/3 or 3/4 of the way up on the, and his name was Joshu Sasaki. And he actually just passed away about a year or two ago. Yeah, he lived to be 104 or 105. So I flew to Los Angeles. They were very kind. They came and picked me up at the airport there and took me up to Mount Baldy. And then I did a sesshin up there for 8 or 10 days. And then I stayed there and practiced for about a month. And then I thought, after I finished this sesshin, I thought, wow, this is just too good. So I thought, like, I don't want this sesshin ever to end. It's so wonderful. So then I was pretty well convinced. And while I was up there, I met a sort of a very older German nun, Zen nun. And she was a student of Sasaki Roshi, but she'd also been over to Kyoto. So I told her I was going to Kyoto, and she was telling me about the Roshis that she'd met over there. And especially she'd met Professor Nishitani. So Professor Nishitani was, at that time, he was a professor at Kyoto University, and he was sort of probably the preeminent Zen scholar and philosophy teacher in Japan. And he had been in Germany before the war and had studied with Heidegger. So I said, wow, I said, that's somebody I really want to meet. So, fortunately, I was meeting this nun quite frequently up there, seeing her around. So I kept pestering her, please, So first she was just telling me, and I was saying, that just sounds wonderful. That sounds wonderful. So then after I started to pester her, please, give me a letter of introduction to Professor Nishitani, And she's a little bit dubious, I don't think, she was wondering if this is really a good idea to give an American some letter like this. But finally she relented and she gave me a letter of introduction. And it turned out where I was staying there at Doshisha, it was just a little bit away from Kyoto University. So I went over, I arranged to meet Professor Nishitani. And in the meantime, I was already studying Japanese, as well as doing some teaching there at Doshisha and some activity. So I went over, I met Professor Nishitani, and then I met him a few times, and, you know, I'd go and see him every week for a while. And I was thinking, wow, it'd be great. I can just enroll here and then I'll study with him and do a PhD or something. And then after about 2 or 3 months, then Professor Nishitani, one day I came in and he sort of looked at me and he says, do you really want to do a PhD or do you want to practice? Right. And I said immediately, no, I really, I want to practice. And then he said, well, one of my students is now the teaching Roshi at Tenryu-ji. So Tenryu-ji was also another one of the 5 main Zen centers, Rinzai temples in Kyoto. Very, very ancient site in Arashiyama, which was at that time just on the outskirts of the city. Now it's totally submerged within the city of Kyoto, but surrounded. But at that time it was like in the suburbs of Kyoto, very beautiful, peaceful place. And it's like the temple, the main temple there is a national treasure, beautiful Zen garden there and all. So he said, okay, well, I'll give you an introduction to my student, Hirata Roshi. And he's not the head, he wasn't the head Roshi there. They had 2 Roshis. One was very amusing and, how would you say, eccentric kind of Roshi, who was the head Roshi of Tenryu-ji, Seki Bokuo. I think maybe you've met, or at least you had some calligraphies by him.
Yes, I have, yeah.
And the other, who was, you know, teaching there every day, supervising all the students, was Hirata Roshi. So he gave me an introduction to him. I went over and saw him, and he said, yeah, why don't you know, finish your Japanese for a month or 2, a few months, and then come over, and then you can stay in Zendo here. So I said, wow, that's great. And there was an American man who was a student of his that had been staying in Tenryu-ji for a long time and had married a Japanese lady and had several children. And he was a good practitioner, Mitva-san, his name was. So he stayed in one of the outlying outer temples that surround the perimeter of Tenryu-ji. And there was another German monk there. His name was Heinz. And he had been studying there for 4 or 5 years. But he wasn't, neither of these people were going in the Soto because of that. They weren't up for that at all. So they were both staying and practicing in the outlying temples. And until that time, then I went to some other places also in Kyoto and practiced. And one time I went to Daitokuji, and then I met a young Roshi there. His name was Morinaga Roshi. And he was at Ryoan-ji. That was his temple. So Ryoan-ji, I don't know if most of the viewers know, but that is the site of the most iconic rock garden in Japan. That's the one you always see in every photo. The rake, the sand, true. With the beautiful, I mean, just incredible. So that's a very, very, very wealthy temple because they have every Japanese person, if they go to visit Kyoto, they have to visit Ryoan-ji. And, you know, all the temples have a small admission fee. You know, at that time it was about $3 or something.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, if there's, you know, tens and hundreds of thousands of tourists coming through there every year, and they just have a very limited time where that happens, they became very well off. So he had used the money that he collected there to build actually a practicing Zendo, right within the confines of Ryoan-ji. And of course, you know, he made it the most exquisite, you know, that he could, because the whole temple there is designated a national treasure. And so he had this beautiful but quite small Zendo. Maybe it could hold 15 people at the most, something like that. And he wanted to, you know, have practice sessions there. So before I went to Tenryu-ji, he was just starting. So I went to the first session that he had at Ryoan-ji. And we stayed there for about 10 days. And then I went subsequently to about 2 or 3 others. And, you know, you'd stay right in Ryoan-ji. And in the morning, one of the jobs was to rake this garden. So it was perfect for the tourists when they came. And it was really an amazing opportunity. And he was very, very kind teacher. Unfortunately, I see he also has passed away. Not so old, but anyway. So, and then I went to Tenryu-ji. I spent, you know, I was the only Westerner there. It was sort of a hard adaptation. So if you weren't adapting well or asking too many questions, you definitely get a few punches.
Yeah. It's pretty harsh in those places.
So I spent a whole season there in Tenryu-ji. Absolutely wonderful experience. And while I was there, they had the kind of celebration when Sekiboko was officially enthroned as the head abbot of Tenryu-ji, as the Kancho-sama, and then all the different famous and, you know, not so famous Rinzai and other Zen school and other Buddhist masters from all over Japan came to attend this ceremony. And we got the opportunity, you know, just in passing to meet a lot of those really great individuals. And at that time, you know, the sort of 2 preeminent teachers in Japan were Omori Sogen, in the Rinzai school at least, were Omori Sogen and Yamada Mumon. And both of them came. So then after the season finished, then one day I was seeing the Roshi, and he said, why don't you go to Tokyo? I was thinking, I don't really want to go to Tokyo. That's like a huge city. You know, Kyoto is like a very rural kind of place compared to Tokyo. Tokyo, there's almost no open space any place. And, you know, Tenryu-ji is like heaven. But he said, you know, I think I'm going to write a letter to Omori Sogen and send you over there. So I said, okay. I didn't really know who Omori Sogen was. I hadn't really met him or anything. So I said, fine. So I went to see Omori Sogen, and this was at Teshukai. So he had this center in the middle of Tokyo in Higashi Nakano, which is like a very congested area near the center of Tokyo. And he had a small house there, and next to it on the garden, he'd wiped out the garden and built a dojo there. And he had lots of lay students that came there every morning and every evening, and he would teach meditation, and then he'd teach Kendo, the Hojo, and he'd also teach calligraphy there every morning. And then every evening from like 5:30 or 6 until 8:30, there'd be sitting practice. And pretty much most of the days, Roshi himself would come and attend the sessions there. It was really very good opportunity. And he was extremely relaxed and always in a very happy mood. And, after we had practice, both in the morning, especially in the morning, Roshi, he would like to sit around and chat with mostly the senior students there. And one of those was Terayama Sensei and several others that were, quite advanced students. And and then he said, okay, well, you stay here in Teshukai, because they had room upstairs. So there was a few young people. There was 2 or 3 young Japanese that liked to come and stay there and study and also practice every day. And then we'd sort of clean the place, keep it up, and then they provided plenty of rice and beans and other things, and whatever people just donated. So there was no lack of food. So we'd cook a breakfast or a lunch every day we'd have, and then cook a dinner and we'd have after the practice in the evening, and that was plenty. And then they had 1 or 2 medium-sized rooms that had tatami, and they had plenty of futons. So we just, spread out, and everybody would sleep there, unless we were woken in the middle of the night by some earthquake shaking there in Tokyo. But, the Japanese, they're so used to it. The first few times I was really startled. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, the whole building would be shaking. But the Japanese, they just sleep right through it. So I practiced there, and was really wonderful. And then Omori Roshi, he was very low-keyed and very humorous, but again, very focused on not just kind of passively sitting, but having some real energetic development with your practice. And especially he did that through, teaching calligraphy, and especially through the Kendo practice and the kind of forms they did with these wooden sticks, not so much actively fighting, but kind of form that you would practice, and lots of actually shouting that went on during that practice, which is supposed to intensify your energy and your presence right there. So it was something I really related to. So then Omori Roshi, he got some, he was not like most of the Zen great masters in Japan, because 1, he wasn't a monk. He was married and, had a wife and a daughter. And but also, he wasn't the head of some great institution. So he had very, very meager financial resources compared to most of these great temples in Japan. Like Tenryu-ji is just flooded with money, or even Yamada Muman, because he was a monk and he was a very public Zen master. He had enormous numbers of sponsors, and even the most moderate, masters, even if they didn't really have that greater knowledge or practice. They had tons of money at that time. Money wasn't a problem for the Zen establishment in Japan. It was finding people that really were motivated to practice apart from just having to go through the training in order to be qualified and certified to take over their family temple, wherever it was, and going back and running that. So Omori Sogen was completely not interested in that. He wanted to find people that really were interested in practice. And he was from the tradition of Teshu. So, as you know, it was named Teshu Kai. So, who had been one of the great, not only practitioners, but also, sort of what we would call a Renaissance man back in Meiji era and after. And he'd been one of the head political advisors, but he'd also been one of the people that, revitalized a lot of the Japanese arts like calligraphy and Kendo and these other aspects of Japanese culture that were based on Zen. So that was Omori Sogen's aspiration. So finally he got he was invited, I think by Mitsui or Mitsubishi, one of these big trading houses, to come and, start teaching some of their executives to get them whipped into shape. So he was getting finally some donation from that. So his aspiration was to build a Zendo himself. So he found a temple outside of Kyoto. Seitaiji was just about 40 minutes out from Shinjuku. And the head priest there liked Omori Sogen very much. So he gave him a place and gave him some funds to build Zendo there. So after I'd been in there for about 8 months, then Omori Sogen said, well, the Zendo out at, outside of Tokyo is pretty much finished. So I'm going to spend most of my time from now out there. So I said, why don't you come out there? So I said, great. So I went out there and I spent about a year out there. Very, very cold winters. They have like the icicles are hanging on the, about 3 feet long off the eaves of the Zendo. So when you're doing the sesshin in December or January, they have all the paper shoji windows flung open. The wind is howling through the Zendo. You're breathing. You're not supposed to wear anything except the prescribed cotton clothes. But, if it wasn't visible on the outside, you could wear a sleeveless sweater vest or something like under your kimono. But otherwise, it wasn't allowed. But every day, Omori Sogen would be there, and no matter what it was like. In the summer, it was beautiful, and went out there, and he would give, interview every day almost. It was really amazing opportunity. And you could see him quite frequently throughout the day also. So he was very, very accessible and very kind. And then, stayed there. There was, one or two other American Japanese that had come there to study. And we just did all the traditional routine there. We had a big vegetable garden we'd take care of. We had a big, we'd go begging throughout the rural neighborhoods there. Sometimes even, I learned to recite the sutras well enough, I'd go with the other monks there and recite sometimes for a morning sutras at, different sponsors' houses or something like that, wearing waraji and straw sandals. And then one time, so this was really a big deal, in the summer, they decided they were all going to climb Mount Fuji. So we went to climb Mount Fuji, and not only were they going to climb Mount Fuji, but they were going to climb Mount Fuji in the traditional Zen monk attire. But that included the waraji. So I was having climbed a lot of mountains back in Montana, I was a little skeptical about that one point. So having learned, having the right sense, about how Japanese do things. They always follow the rules, but, they might have something extra in their rucksack just in case.
Yeah.
Right? So I had a pair of very light tennis shoes in my rucksack as well. So, sure enough, by the time we got to the top of Mount Fuji, you can drive up about halfway, and then you start climbing up Mount Fuji at about 1:30 or 2 in the morning. You go to a rest hut. You go to sleep at 8. You get up at 1:30, and then you start climbing so you can be there as the sun comes up. So we did that, and we got up to the top of Mount Fuji just as the sun was rising. It was freezing, but then, warmed up very rapidly. But, everybody had just brought 1 or 2 pairs of these straw sandals. And then they had their tabi on, the white Japanese sock with the toes in them. But unfortunately, by the time they got to the top, they were already on their second pair of straw sandals. And luckily, I still had my tennis shoes in the rucksack. So by the time we were coming down, it's all just this very rough scree that you're just sliding down for maybe 5,000 feet. There's no other way to get down. So most of these, my friends, their waraji were totally worn through. Then they were just coming down on their socks, and those didn't last more than 5 minutes. And then, they were having to walk down on bare feet, and a lot of them were really, really, raw and bloody feet by the time they got down. And I have to say, I did put on my tennis shoes, but even those, the soles were completely through. That's how rough the trip was.
Wow.
Anyway, it was a wonderful, experience, and really done in the, kind of ultimate Japanese spirit of privilege.
Not giving up.
Yeah. Gambate. Gambate kudasai, which means stick to it, endure.
Yeah.
Do your best. And then I was also very fortunate because while I'd been in Kyoto, I had met a couple friends, and especially I met 2 French friends. One was Jacques, who I haven't seen since, but he's a very tall French fellow, and he was quite a good, maybe about 6'2" or 6'3", and he was a student of Yamada Muman, and I hope he's still practicing in France. Maybe you've heard of him. Anyway, I don't know what his name is. He has a very tall, thin fellow with a great big nose and good sense of humor. And the other, I met another French friend that I became very, very good friends with, and he had a scholarship from the French, top architecture school. for 2 or 3 years to go to Japan and study Japanese architecture, because then he was going to come back to France and complete his studies. I think it was in the École Nationale of Architecture, whatever it was called. So we became very good friends, and he was also going as a lay person most of the time to study with Yamada Muman. But during the summer and fall breaks or winter breaks, then they would have a break for about a month or two in the training at the Zendos, so everyone would go home. So we didn't have any place to go because, all the other Japanese, they would just go to their home temples, because virtually everyone except for at Omori Sogen's, virtually all the Japanese in these places were from families that had for many, many generations run Rinzai temples all over Japan, and they were going there to become accredited to take over the family temple. So we would go on different adventures. So twice we went over to Korea, and in Busan, there's a huge Zen temple there, Bo Musa. And there was a very famous monk there. His name was Yang Hik. And he was teaching something very much like Tai Chi, but lots of these kind of energetic yoga exercises and things, as well as meditation. So one time, the two of us, we went over there and stayed in Korea at this place for, a month and a half, and stayed with Yang Hik, and he taught us all this system of Korean yoga that's supposed to be used for enhancing meditation. And on top of that, then we learned, about Korean Zen temple food, which basically consists of rice and, occasionally, maybe once or twice a week, a bowl of vegetables, and then every day, a huge bowl of fried chilies.
Wow.
So that was the vegetable you got. So believe me, if you didn't have some kind of energetic opening from doing the practices that Yang Hik was, every lunch you'd go there and you'd have the top of your head blown off by these unbelievably hot chilies. Oh my God! You just bite into that, and it almost like going into a kind of fit. You just break out in a sweat. It was a big temple, so most of the people there weren't studying with Yang Hik. It was a big formal temple, but they'd all sort of gaze over at us two Westerners and be chuckling and watching us eat this Korean food. And then another time during one of the summer break, one time we went up to Songkwangsa. And so this was the place. There's a very famous Korean Zen master. I think he's the most famous Korean Zen master from recent times. So that was his temple. This was sort of like in the center of Korea, not in Busan. So Busan is right on the southernmost tip of Korea, right on the ocean, a big port. But Songkwangsa, it's in this beautiful setting. I think they have several thousand acres at that time of temple grounds, and it's all, in forest preserve. And then this beautiful ancient temple buildings there. And at the time, he had quite a few Western students even then, but later he came to the States and to Europe and had many Western disciples. And I think he still has students and students of students. So we went and stayed with him. I thought he was, excellent teacher. I didn't think he was quite at the same I mean, he didn't quite have the same impact on me as Omori Sogen or Yamada Muman, but anyway, it was great. And they had extremely good facilities there. I was very impressed because the Koreans have a system, because in Korea it's even colder than in Japan. And in the winter, they have clay floors in the Zendo. And everyone doesn't sit on a raised bench like you do in Japan, but they all sit right on the floor, and they have tubes, or partitions running through the floor, and they build a fire on the outside, big fireplace, and then the whole winter they keep the floor of the Zendo heated. And you can just sit on this very warm floor, and it has two benefits. Much better than having the room heated, because it keeps your energy low. So where you're seated, the heat is coming up through the floor. It's not, causing your head to spin from heat, like, an electric heater in the room or something. And then at the same time, very, very, very comfortable. And they have very long sessions in the winter. They're about 3 months. So I was always tempted to go and do one of those, but it never quite happened. And then the third time, I went with my friend because he had a motorbike. So one time we went touring all over southern Japan. And first we went to the Japanese Alps. And because I was enthusiastic about mountain climbing from back in Montana, we went and decided we were going to climb the highest peak in the Japanese Alps. Since they'd already climbed Mount Fuji, I said, well, I got to do the second one. So we went there and we climbed to the top of the highest peak in the Japanese Alps. It was a wonderful, beautiful day, and we stayed in the mountaineering huts up there. Had a wonderful time, and I remember very clearly we climbed the highest peak and we came back. We got back to the hut, and they had a TV in the hut. And lo and behold, we looked up at the TV, having just gotten back from this, and Richard Nixon was on the TV resigning.
Oh.
A fitting moment.
Yeah.
And then after that, I had an introduction Omori Roshi had given me to the Osho-san at Hakuin Zenji's temple. And we went to his temple. It was out in the countryside, and we spent, after having gone climbing for 10 days or so, then we spent the rest of the off season from the Zendo there. It was about a month. It was completely in a rural area of little more southern part of Japan. The Osho-san was very kind, very special place there. We just stayed there for a month. We were the only, aside from tourists coming to visit, we were the only, not just Westerners, but he didn't have any other Japanese really staying there. So we helped him, and we fixed the garden every day. And, the Osho-san, he was quite, how would you say, reserved and a little bit old-fashioned, not extravagant type at all. Very, very careful with his money, and we had just sort of very, very basic food. So, but every day we used to go out, and while we were gardening out there, we'd eat a watermelon or two from out in the garden, since they had, he had a huge watermelon patch. And other kinds of things. So then one day the Osho-san, was like we were going to be leaving in 3 or 4 days. And he said, okay, come this evening. And we weren't expecting anything. And he had beautiful Japanese dinner that he'd prepared or gotten someone to help prepare and everything. And then he said, okay, you two kind of go to it. And then he was watching, and we, ate about half of it. And he was sort of wondering, why aren't they just gobbling this down? Well, he didn't know we'd each eaten a watermelon about an hour before. But, after about an hour or so and a little bit of sake, then we got our second wind, and we definitely finished it off. So it wasn't any problem. But that was really, very... I think that had some profound effect. I had several very good dreams while I was staying at that temple. And really, you could really feel the presence of Hakuin at that place. So anyway, then, but I was still thinking, it seems like, the tradition in Japan as a whole was really not quite up to the, what it had been, even though there were a couple of really high points. And I must say, I didn't meet Yamada Muman more than a few times, but, apart from Omori Sogen, he was really something special. He really had a very, very powerful presence. You could just get some kind of indication just from being with him for 20, 30 seconds. Something very special. So, and Terayama Sensei was very, very kind, he was one of the main students of Omori Roshi. Without his kind of encouragement and everything, because being in Japan, it's pretty tough. They really don't let up too much. So, and he had a little more perspective on Westerners. And, some days when I was feeling a little discouraged or just, sort of gritting my teeth, he would come up and just sort of talk to me in a very kind way and, yeah, don't worry, everything will work out, just relax a little. And it was very, very, very good. Whereas, all the Japanese are not at all into giving any explanations about anything, right? You're just going to ping, you want to connect, you want to get it. So I really appreciate that. But in the beginning, if you're in a very, very different kind of culture, it really helped a lot to have him, Yeah. And once in a while, when I was in Tokyo there at Teshukai, he would just say, oh, in the evening, he said, yeah, why don't you come with me, and have some, yakisoba or something like that in the evening. He'd just invite me and take me out, and we just have a beer and some Chinese food or whatever, and very, 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 very kind.
Wonderful.
So then, I was thinking, and especially even Omori Sogen, he was very frequently commenting, things really, they're not what they used to be, and that's why he made this Zendo up at Seitaiji, hoping he could get some people that weren't like professional Zen priests, to actually come and practice. So, and he did, but, it was not so easy all the time. And he would always comment, because every week or every 2 weeks, he would take the Shinkansen and go to Kyoto, because one of the what is it? Keninji, maybe? Mm-hmm. It's one of the other main Zen temples, very, very famous Zen temple in Kyoto. That's very ancient, one of the most ancient sites, also one of the big tourist sites in Kyoto. And the head priest there would invite him every week or every 2 weeks to come down and, just visit him. But actually, he's getting teachings, but, they're not saying that because he's actually more, in a more elevated position according to his rank than Omori Sogen, and older as well. And Omori Sogen, he would come back, the Keninji head priest was very, very kind man. I met him several times. And Omori Sogen would always come back after a weekend in Kyoto, and he'd be come in the morning on Monday, come into Teshukai, and after the practice, we'd all be drinking tea together, and Omori Sogen would be smiling and sort of relaxed, but also chuckling and laughing. And then the older Japanese students would be conversing and asking, well, Roshi, how was your trip to, Kyoto? How was Keninji? And Omori Sogen, he'd always sort of laugh, and he'd shake his head and he'd say, oh, that Keninji Osho-san, he's such a kind man. He's such a good person. He said, he doesn't know anything about Zen, but he's really a good person. Just say it right there. He doesn't know anything about Zen, but he's a wonderful person. So that was sort of the best that he could hope for in most cases. And then while I was at Teshukai, actually, Omori Sogen, he'd never even completed high school, but he was appointed, the head of the Rinzai School University. He was appointed to be the chairman or the provost or whatever you want to call it in Japanese of the Rinzai School University Hanazono Daigaku in Kyoto. It's quite a large university. I think at that time it had about 3,000 or 5,000 students. And, it just goes to show you how highly he was respected in, by all the other Zen masters in Japan, because, as I said, he didn't even have a high school degree, let alone a university degree. And but he had, an amazing, from his practice and experience, in-depth understanding of Zen, from a very experience-oriented perspective, which virtually no one else had.
Would you be able to? Yes, please go on.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, then I was going to say, then I was feeling, though, from what Omori Sogen was saying and everything, I thought I'd like to see what some of the tradition was like in other places, especially in China and Taiwan, if there was anything left there. So then I was starting to feel in my mind after about 3 years, I'd like to go and visit those places and see what's happening.
Before leaving Japan, could you say something about Omori Sogen as a teacher, and how was your personal relationship with him, and perhaps even some Sanzen moments when you were just the two of you together in a how do you say, like a meditation interview, practice interview?
Yeah. So Omori Sogen, at least with he was extremely kind all the time. You know, he's never acting as he could as like a very, very high level Zen master or something. He's always acting like he was your uncle. And, you know, frequently he would just invite me over to his residence, which was like very humble house right next to the dojo. So, as I said, he had this little plot, which was in Tokyo, in Higashi Nakano. But even that, you know, he'd had it for a very long time, but that's very difficult to come by. You know, already the property in Tokyo was just unbelievably expensive. And he'd taken out the garden and built this beautiful, but, you know, not really some kind of exquisite artistic kind of dojo. It was like more of a functional kind of building, just bare bones kind of a place, but, you know, as large as he could make it. So I think it was about 25 by 25 or 30 by 30 feet square, maybe. So it could hold maybe 30, 40 people, you know, if they're really packed in the morning, or he's giving some special teaching or something like that. And then, you know, his very simple, old Japanese style house was just next to that. And that was about it. And then I remember you could look out the second floor of the window at Teshukai, where, you know, the few students that were staying there stayed. And next door, there was this giant white mansion with a beautiful Japanese garden in it. And all the other students always said, "Oh, that belongs to this Yakuza chief." Oh. So that's why he has so much money to build a place like that. You know, it's one of the head Yakuza people in Tokyo. So anyway, we'd go over and see, you know, Omori Sogen. Sometime he'd invite you just over unexpectedly for, you know, a bite to eat or some tea, and he'd just sort of talk to you and see how things are going. And then, you know, always he was teaching Mu. So I think what he wanted to see was just that, you know, development of presence and energy. You know, he wanted to see that you're building up your energy level, and with that, building up your level of presence. So that's actually very close to what they do in some of the Dzogchen traditions. And that's also very close to what, you know, I see that you yourself enjoy teaching, right? Very kind of direct. So, and he didn't just want you doing Mu silently, but, you know, if you had the opportunity to really do it out loud with, you know, force, or as they used to say in Japan, Issho Kenmei, which means like, you know, with absolute single pointed direction, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly how he would teach the Kendo practice, or Hojo, which they would do not with Kendo swords, or even bamboo Kendo sticks, but with these wooden, very blunt but quite heavy wooden sticks that were formed like something, you know, general shape of a Kendo sword. And, you know, that doing that practice, I think a lot of your students have seen it, but, you know, they would do that with a lot of very, very direct kind of shouts where you're just supposed to be accessing your primordial energy.
Yeah.
And presence. So the most important point that Omori Sogen always emphasized, whether it was in Sanzen or doing this Kendo practice or doing the calligraphy practice was this energetic, direct, focused presence, right? 100% just throwing yourself into that and maintaining that presence. So a lot of the Kendo practice, there were like stylistic moves that you would make, and you would usually do it with someone. So there would be a second person that would be mirroring your practice. So it was like a ritual combat between the two of you. And, the thing that he always emphasized was, of course, maintaining eye contact, but without being riveted on the other person's eyes as a kind of objective, broad field, objective presence, not losing that for an instant, and then always upping the ante with another shout, another breath, right? Like that. So this was very, very different from what anyone else was teaching. I mean, I think Yamada Muman definitely had extremely powerful presence, but I didn't get a sense from my French friends that were studying with him that he was actually teaching methods to, get to that point. So that was something you really had to pick up from being with him, rather than, him having a very graduated way of approaching and developing that. So that's something I really think Omori Sogen, and after his disciples, Terayama Sensei, and then when I was there, there was another second generation, I believe, Japanese fellow there. I was there. His name was Hosogawa-san. So he was about my age, and he was, in the beginning, he was very interested in wood carving and, carving like traditional Japanese statues and things like that out of wood. And he was a very, very excellent craftsman, very quiet, and he stayed he rented a little room just right next to Teshukai and stayed there. He wasn't very interested in going to the Zendo and doing the sesshin and things like that. But he studied with Omori Roshi for quite a long time, and he had come from a center in Hawaii where one of Omori Roshi's students had started a center. And after he came back to the States here, I haven't seen him actually since. I saw him in Japan, but I know he came back to the States. He taught and became a Roshi himself. He was teaching in Hawaii for quite a long time. But now I think, thanks to you, I did connect with his student, who I enjoyed speaking to very much, Meido Moore. And he has a Zendo now in that same tradition in Wisconsin in the U.S. So if some people want to, and he's quite open. So if people like to go there, stay, study, I think, and he's quite knowledgeable also. I haven't met him personally. I just met him over the internet, but and chatted with him a few times. But I'd like to invite him to come and visit me one time when the virus is settled down. And but he seems to be continuing that tradition quite nicely. So I'm not sure what's going on in the center in Hawaii now. I did go and visit there one time when I was in Hawaii, and it seems like it's completely gone in another direction and not connected with Omori Roshi anymore. But anyway, that's what Omori Sogen was all about, in a nutshell. It's not like, you're going to get some immediate kind of, I wouldn't say, he wasn't emphasizing, getting some immediate breakthrough or insight. He was more about, just keep with this type of practice and it's going to produce its own results.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I don't know. Is that the kind of feeling you got from Terayama Sensei?
Well, my time with Sensei was, unfortunately, I didn't spend that long with him, but I still do consider, even if he passed away a long time ago, I still feel him. He was a very special person to me in my life, and I haven't had people like that who I see in that way. I don't have but a couple of people like that in all of my life. So our connection from the beginning was very deep and very profound for both of us, and we both felt it from the first time when we met. And I'll be happy to tell how we actually met the first time. We met in other time, but I'll just say that we met first time at Zen Shoan in Yamaoka Teshu's temple in Tokyo on his 19th of July 2004, 19th of July, which is the passing day of Teshu Yamaoka. There's a large ceremony in Zen Shoan temple, and that's where we met on that day, on Teshu's Memorial Day, with Sensei the first time there. And it was like an instant click, and we recognized it. The first moment when our eyes met, it was a connection. As you were telling those stories and Kendo or Kenjutsu practice with Omori Sogen, I started coming, fond memories started coming to my mind. And Sensei was a really good teacher, and he was also, like you said, very kind, very knowledgeable. And one thing that really impressed me then and has impressed me, throughout these years when he hasn't been around anymore, is that he understood that I'm a Westerner, and that, if the tradition, his tradition, Omori Sogen's tradition, if it were to come to life in outside Japan, then the writing wouldn't be in kanji, in Chinese letters. It would have to be different, and that's why Sensei always encouraged me to experiment and to find my own way, really, with what he taught in that context that had that writing in kanji and Japanese cultural context. So I don't want to take too much time about talking about myself and my experiences, since this is your interview. but I'll just say that was a very special connection with Terayama Sensei and myself. Unfortunately, it didn't last that long, but I still practice what he teaches in a lot of things that we do in Pemako Buddhism. And for example, you have followed my postings in Facebook. So, for example, the stage analysis or Bhumi analysis that we do, it started from Terayama Sensei's teaching, which is to sense the Bokki, sense the energy, the transmission from the black ink, calligraphy. So that's how it started originally for me, and I was fortunate to be educated in that by Terayama Sensei directly.
Yes, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but that's exactly what Omori Sogen was always teaching with calligraphy, because in the beginning, you wouldn't really write Chinese characters or kanji. He would just have you write a single stroke. Again and again and again and again, and again. And then, but then every day, maybe 3 days a week. So he would alternate at Teshukai. 3 days a week, we'd do calligraphy after the morning sitting practice under his guidance. And then the other days we would do the Kendo practice. So because the dojo was very small, it wasn't possible to do two, but then Roshi himself would, supervise. And then when you finish the calligraphy practice, he would post all the calligraphies, pin them up on the walls, and then he'd give a little comment about, many of them. And, he was always talking about how these, express the mind, reflected the mind and the energy of the person that did them. And then on the walls, way up on the higher walls of the dojo, he also had some really great calligraphy from Teshu and some other masters that was hung up there. And, then he'd point to those and say, look at this, feel, connect with that, see, especially at this point or that point. And then often, people would bring books of contemporary calligraphers and to be showing him. So they would ask, what do you think about this calligraphy? What do you think about that? And then, Omori Sogen, he wasn't hesitant to express. He'd say, oh, that mazui calligraphy, which means that wretched, that horrible calligraphy, it's just like decoration, that was the thing that he absolutely was not interested in. There's a lot of calligraphy. It's just kind of decorative. And it looks very pretty in its form, outward form, but it has absolutely no kind of presence or power to it whatsoever. So that, he would immediately comment on that. So, yeah, I think the calligraphy, the way of looking at that, and that sort of imbues your way of looking at the whole world.
It does, yeah. Did you do you have like a calligraphy or painting collection? Did you start collecting calligraphies?
No, unfortunately, I didn't, and I was always very, very interested in art. I'm sorry that I didn't do that in one way, but I'll tell you a story. So then after I decided I was going to take a break and I was going to go to China or Hong Kong or Taiwan and see what sort of Buddhism and Zen Chan was going on there. So during one of the vacation periods, I went first to Hong Kong and then to Taiwan. And when I was in Hong Kong, I did have a little money. So I had a friend that knew quite a bit about art. And so at that time was the Cultural Revolution. And so in Hong Kong, and especially in Macau, you could buy like extremely beautiful things for like almost nothing. I didn't have a big budget, but I had a small budget, but it was more than enough to buy those kind of things at that time. So I bought a lot of old Chinese paintings. I bought a lot of antique jade, some of it as far back from the Han Dynasty and things, but a lot from very old things. I bought a lot of great things. I mean, at that time, you could buy a painting by Chi Pai Shi for maybe, $1,000, $1,000 or $2,000. Now they're, tens of millions.
Wow.
Yeah. So I bought a lot of very nice things, and I put them in my cabin, our family's cabin in Montana, up in the attic, because I figured, that's a very safe place. No robbers are going to be coming there. Well, nobody knew about it anyway. And then the weather is dry in the winter, so not too damp in the summer. So, easily the things would be preserved. And so I did that, but then about 5 years later, one day, my brother called up, and I was talking to him and my father on the telephone, and they said, well, yesterday night we had an electric short and the cabin burned down.
Oh.
Yeah. So then I was saying, oh my God. So then I thought, this is just a sign. I shouldn't be focusing on being an art collector or doing any of this stuff. I'm just going to leave it for now. And I'm not going to do this in the future. So then I just stopped. And then maybe 10 years after that, I went back to Taiwan to translate for a lot of the Tibetan lamas that were visiting there at the time. And a couple of my Taiwan friends that had helped me buy all this stuff, they came to the airport to meet me. They knew I was coming. They said, John, do you still have this thing we bought? Do you still have that thing? He said, how much do you want for it? I'll give you, whatever you want.
Oh, wow.
Because the Chinese art market was taking off. So a lot of those things, I just bought for $100 or something. They're worth like $100,000.
Oh.
I said, well, I have some news for you. It's all ashes.
Wow. That's awful. That's awful.
Well, in one way it's awful, but in another way it probably kept me from being too, distracted by that. So anyway, so much for the art collecting side of things.
So would you like to talk more about, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or how you already mentioned Tibetan lamas. How did you find your way to Tibetan Buddhism?
It's through that. So I'll just speak, very not as long about that as about Japan, because, so I did go to Taiwan. I couldn't get into mainland China, but I stayed in Taiwan for like a year and a half. And I intensively studied with really one of the top martial arts teachers there. He was a very famous Tai Chi teacher from the mainland. And,
what was his name?
Wang Yan.
Okay.
Wang Yan. And I met him also very fortuitously, because when I went to Taiwan, I didn't know where to stay. So I just stayed at the Yanshan Hotel, which was the government, very nice government hotel right at the northern edge of Taipei. And then I came down in the morning and asked the desk clerk, who was a great martial arts teacher in Taiwan. And he said, oh, just go, 100 yards in front of the hotel. There's the park, and there's this very famous teacher. He teaches there every morning. So I just wandered down there and met him. And then I went to university in Taiwan for about a year. I studied Chinese. My Chinese got quite okay, because conversational Chinese, it's a lot more easy than Japanese, and I already had a background from Japanese. And then, then I met a lot of the Buddhist teachers in Taiwan. But again, I wasn't very much feeling a connection with a lot of them. I thought, I actually thought that this Tai Chi master, he had a lot more presence and meditative ability than some of the Zen masters I met in Taiwan. And they're very into very kind of heavily monastic system there. I wasn't very interested in that either. And then I had a friend, a Western friend, an American friend I'd met in Taiwan, who was a photographer and a journalist about my age. And he went on a trip to Nepal. And then he went on a trek in Nepal. And he came back. He had a photo exhibit in one of the universities in Taiwan. So he invited me to the opening. And so I went there and I saw the photos that he'd taken on his trek. And actually, he had visited a couple of the famous Rinpoches and met them on the trek. And he had stopped at this one place called Tupten Choling, which is the very old temple that's up in a monastery that's up in the Sherpa area of Solukhumbu on the Everest trek, and met Trulshik Rinpoche, who happened to be there, and he had a photo of Trulshik Rinpoche there, and I saw this photo and I said, yeah, this is someone with some real, definitely some, realization, very high level of realization. So I said, and then I went home so I sort of chalked in my mind that I was going to go to Nepal. And I went home that summer for vacation, for the summer vacation. I went back to Montana. And while I was in Montana, there was this mountaineering group that I was a member of, and they were having a trek to go to Nepal. Just happened that fall. So I said, oh, that's great. I'll just join the trek. I'll already be over in Taiwan, so I'll just fly over from Taiwan to Nepal, join them for the trek. And then I'll see, check out and try to meet some of these Tibetan masters. And so I signed up for the trek and left from Taiwan to Nepal. I didn't know anything about Tibetan Buddhism. So, about 2 weeks before, I grabbed a book that I found in the bookstore in Taipei. And this was by someone that had been, a student of a lot of the Tibetan lamas. I think it was John Blofeld, maybe. But I'm not quite remembering. Anyway, I was reading this book on the flight from Bangkok. First you have to, there weren't any direct flights from Taiwan. So you fly to Bangkok, then you get on Thai Airways. That was like the only airlines that was flying daily to Nepal, and then fly in. And I was reading this book on the flight into Nepal, and he's telling about all the different lamas that he's met. And he says, well, but really, the greatest meditator, the greatest master from, the Tibetan tradition in Kathmandu now, it has to be Dudjom Rinpoche. And I just read that sentence and it really struck me. So I said, yeah, I got to meet Dudjom Rinpoche. I'd never heard of him before, but here I was on the plane, and then I looked out the window, and the plane was about 40 minutes before landing in Kathmandu, and it's flying parallel with the Himalayas there, and you can see Mount Everest and all this huge vista of the Himalayan peaks in the distance. I looked out there. that's for me. It's like another one of that's for me moments that I've had. So I landed in Kathmandu, and we had, 2 days before the trek started, for the preparations and, them giving you equipment rundown and everything. So as soon as I landed, I went out to, got in a taxi, put everything in my room, got in a taxi, went to the desk and asked them, who's Dudjom Rinpoche? Do any of you people know Dudjom Rinpoche? But one of the people at the desk, they'd heard of Dudjom Rinpoche, and they said, I think he has a temple out in Bodhanath, which is sort of out on the outskirts of Kathmandu. So I said, oh, really? He said, yeah, I think so. They don't really know very much, but anyway. So I got in a taxi and told them, please go to this place, go to Dudjom Rinpoche's temple. And lo and behold, I arrived there. And there's lots of activity going on, very small, very, very small temple. The whole temple is about the size also of Teshukai, about 30 by 30. And but lots of activity going on, and they're putting up lots of tents, and there were lots of yogis all with their white skirts running around and, building things and putting up things. So I asked one of them, and, one person spoke a little bit of English, older fellow. And he said, no, Dudjom Rinpoche, he's not coming here now. I said, well, where is he? And he's at his residence in Kathmandu. He said, but you cannot see him now because he's preparing to give this big initiation. This is the Dudjom Tersar, his Terma treasure teachings. He's going to be giving them probably for the last time in his life, the complete teachings like that. But, you won't be able to see him at his house. But, once the teachings start, then you can see him during the day and, maybe after the teachings finish. So this teaching was going on for quite a long time, maybe a month. So I went back. I was a little bit disappointed, but at least I knew, where to go. So I went back the next day. We left on the track. We trekked all the way up to the Everest Base Camp, and lo and behold, on the way, we went right through Thubten Choling, and I remembered my friend's photo, so I asked the head Sherpa, can we go and visit this temple and see if this famous Lama is there, Trulshik Rinpoche? And he said, yes, he's a very great Lama. I also want to visit him. So I said, okay, please take me. So he took me, and a couple other the people on the trek also wanted to go. So we went up, and lo and behold, Trulshik Rinpoche was there. We went right in. We met him. He was exactly sitting in the very place where my friend had photographed him. And we had a very lovely, long interview. I was really very, very strongly impressed. And really, that was like the first great Tibetan master that I met, and there was something a little different there. There's not just the practice of, your chi or your prana or that kind of energy, but there's really expanse of mind energy there. That you can really, it's tangible. It's really tangible. And with most of the really great Tibetan masters, it went from being tangible to being like completely overwhelming. So that was a kind of different experience than I'd had in Japan or China. So then I was immediately I was fixed on that. So then we went on this trek. It was quite a long trek and, very exhausting kind of trek, but we went up to the Everest Base Camp. It was beautiful. We visited some of the famous monasteries up there, Tengboche and Pangboche, where they have the Yeti scalp. And couple other places on the way. And I got back, and on the last day of the trek, we were coming down to the lower areas in the hills where we could, get to a road head, and then the bus was going to come and meet us and take us back to Kathmandu. And then we just got back to the road head, almost to the road head, and the Sherpas are all packing everything up to put it on the bus, and they're wanting to get home. And I saw a bunch of Tibetan lamas over in this field across the way. So naturally, I wandered over there, and the head Sherpa is sort of rolling his eyes. Oh my God, this guy is going off again. We want to get home. But anyway, we went over there. I went over there, and I was talking, and one of the monks, he said, yeah, there's this very great Lama in Kathmandu. I'll give you an introduction. You go and see him when you get there tomorrow. His name is Gusho Seichu. So I said, wonderful. I'd never heard of him, but, I said, that's great. I'll go and visit him. So he gave me an introduction and told me, how to locate him and whatnot, gave his address. And then the head Sherpa came over. Come on, let's get going. What are you doing here? Et cetera, And we got on the bus, went back to Kathmandu. So the next morning I woke up and I went to see Gusho Seichu. The trek is over. So had breakfast at the hotel, and 8:00, got in a taxi, told him, please, wherever this is, take me there. So, and that time Kathmandu is a very, very small little town, it's not congested, maybe, 50,000 people or something. And very easy to get around, almost no traffic, unimaginable today. So he took me sort of out to the outskirts of the city, about 15 minutes away. And Gusho Seichu was living there in this very lovely old Nepali sort of gentleman's, like kind of gentleman landlord kind of house that would have been from the past century, and with a couple of monks. So they invited me in. Gusho Seichu, he just knew a few words of English, but it turns out he's actually Bhutanese, and he was the Lama of that had the close connection with the Nepali king. So he was the teacher of the Buddhist teacher and political advisor also of the Nepali king. And it turned out he knew all the lamas, because all the lamas were Tibetan, but he was in with the government. So they all needed citizenship. If they wanted to buy land, if they didn't have the correct papers, a foreigner couldn't buy any land in Nepal. So even the lamas couldn't build a temple or a gumpa without his help. So he was Mr. Indispensable, and he was also very kind of great Lama in his own right. He really was a special person. And maybe you undoubtedly know of Lama Ole and Hana. From the Viking Lama. And but actually Gusho Seichu was their first teacher when they went to Nepal, and they had a very close connection with him. And so I even saw them with him a few times later on. But I did have hit it off with Gusho Seichu Rinpoche. And can you imagine? So I was sitting there having tea. All the Tibetans are always very nice. They give you tea, some biscuits, whatever, any guest that comes. And then after about an hour talking, he said, yeah, I'm very happy. Come and see me anytime. I'll help you in whatever way you need to study and whatnot. He said, but now I'm a little busy because I have an appointment. I have to go and see Dudjom Rinpoche in 1 hour. And then, something happened then. So I I said, Dudjom Rinpoche? Really? Oh. He said, please. I said, please, Rinpoche, please take me with you. I won't say anything, but please take me with you. So he said, oh, of course, no problem. So then we went off. We walked all the way from Kathmandu to Dudjom Rinpoche's temple over in Boda, which was like a little separate village at the time, and through the rice fields there. And we got there, and Dudjom Rinpoche is we stayed there about 5 minutes, and then there was a break in teachings. And then Gusho Seju took me up there. He, went and greeted Dudjom Rinpoche, offered him a kata. And then he said, oh, and there's this Westerner that came, to see me. And he said he really wanted to meet you. So then he introduced me to Dudjom Rinpoche. Dudjom Rinpoche was sitting on the throne there. I offered him a kata, just a minute or two. But then, oh my God, is just like overwhelming feeling of blessing to be in his presence. So then I knew I absolutely wasn't deceived in the least, I wasn't crazy in what I'd been thinking and reading. And then Dudjom Rinpoche said, yeah, you can come to the teaching here for a while if you like, or at least come to some. And then when the teaching is finished in a couple of weeks, then, after a few days, I'll be in my house in Kathmandu. So then, see, some days I'll have visitors so you can come and see me. I said, thank you so much. I stayed for the teaching and then went there for some days. And then, I was supposed to go back to Taiwan, and I was going to go to the university there and study, etc. But I just sort of postponed my ticket. And then I postponed my ticket again. And then I postponed my ticket again. And then I went to visit Dudjom Rinpoche at his residence. And he gave me a little teaching. And then, but as I said, the real teaching with these super lamas like Dudjom Rinpoche or Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche or Chatral Rinpoche is not, whatever they're telling you with their mouth. It's like you're just getting completely saturated by being in their presence. So, you can't miss it. It's like you've been stamped and sealed for, a week after that. And then very fortunately, so I met Dudjom Rinpoche. He wasn't so easy to see him, but, if you were persistent, he had one time a day where he may or may not receive visitors. And he wasn't so healthy at that point. He was already almost 80. He had quite severe asthma. But if he was feeling well, and if he was, maybe a couple times a week, he would have visitors. So you just have to go at, about 3:30 or 4 o'clock every day and just wait. And sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And then sometimes, you could go and see for an hour or so, or sometimes just for a few minutes. Wasn't sure. But his main activity at that time was editing all the Nyingma Dzogchen Tantras and the oral transmission teachings from the Nyingma. So these were like many volume works that, if he didn't edit these and get them corrected and out there, they would probably be lost. And there weren't other people that were capable of really editing them. Very few lamas had the knowledge to edit these things, because a lot of them are from woodblock prints, not clear, maybe some mistakes also. So you'd have to not only have knowledge of, Tibetan grammar and what should be written there, but you had to know the subject as well to edit them. And that time there was no computer. There were no computers. There was no computerized Tibetan programs. So it all had to be done by hand. And he had a whole group of about 6 or 7 young Bhutanese that were scribes. They were very, very good, excellent calligraphers, and they would write every page out by hand in Tibetan. Then Rinpoche again would review the thing, and then they would send it to New Delhi, and then they had some kind of process. They'd photograph those and then make plates out of them. So, very time-consuming. And even while Rinpoche was, receiving people in the afternoon, still he'd be occasionally correcting something in the text or looking at it for a few minutes or whatnot. Mm-hmm. This is also quite humorous because these Bhutanese, the Bhutanese, they always say the Bhutanese national sport is archery. Mm-hmm. But that's not true. The Bhutanese national sport, any Bhutanese will tell you, is bed hopping. So the Bhutanese, while they were writing all these Nyingma Tantras, Dzogchen Tantras for Dudjom Rinpoche, they'd all be gossiping about who was in whose girlfriend's or wife's bed the evening before.
Okay.
they'd be telling all these stories, and Dudjom Rinpoche, while he was writing all this, he'd sort of be listening out of one ear, and they'd be going on, and they'd be saying, oh, and then he climbed in the window, and then he was going at it with the guy's wife, and then everything, and then they heard something outside, and then there'd sort of be a lull, and they wouldn't say anymore. And then Dudjom Rinpoche would say, Dene, and then, sort of egging them on, don't stop here, to be reticent. So this is generally the Nyingma approach, it's not repressing things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So generally from the Gelugpa, the Sakya, and even the Kagyu schools, they're mostly monastic based. So a lot of it is, tone it down. Don't think about this. Don't talk about this, right? This is inappropriate, right? You shouldn't be doing this, right? But, and even in the Nyingma school, in some parts of the Nyingma school that were heavily monasticized, that was also the approach, although not quite so strongly. But with Dudjom Rinpoche, with Chatral Rinpoche, and with Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, so these are not, monastic people in any way. So even though Khyentse Rinpoche was more of monastic, had more of a monastic emphasis because he was trying to rebuild Session Monastery and reestablish that, but they themselves were not that in any way. So their approach is, let it all come out. Not only let it all come out, really put some fertilizer on it. Get it to just sprout, get that weed to grow up as tall and as fast as it can. And then just when the right moment comes, clip. They just make one remark or even just clear their throat at the right moment, and the whole edifice would just be cut completely off and come tumbling down. And, that's the kind of approach they took generally in a group with, talking with these Bhutanese calligraphers. And that was the same approach they would take with the students, a little more, some of the more durable students in the general way of teaching. They're not going to They're not going to repress anything, and they're going to make sure that you're totally encouraged in all your delusions.
Mm.
So they're completely flowering out, and then, wow, then they apply the coup de grace.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And that can be a rough method, but it's a very, very effective and very, very quick method, because instead of beating around the bush for years and years and years and hoping that these things get worn away at the edges, no, they go right for the core of the matter, right for the heart of the matter. And then, they do you the great favor of, separating you from your illusions. But it can be pretty catastrophic, for a day or two. You definitely need some recovery time, because it can be a hard landing sometimes.
Yeah. This is actually something, sorry to interrupt, but we were discussing Yamaoka Tesshu a couple of moments ago, and this was to me very impressive about Tesshu, because that was also, as a lay Zen practitioner and lay Zen master, that was his way, diving into it rather than toning it down and hush. So that was, to me, has always been very impressive personally, that approach.
I totally agree. I think that's why I was attracted to that in the beginning too. I wasn't really attracted to the kind of, solemn monastic Zen settings in Japan, just the people, sitting very perfectly in rows and things like this. Was sort of like the Myoshinji tradition, very stern, very severe, and everybody just, having the perfect outer appearance.
Yeah.
And, even some of Omori Sogen's students, he had one very good student I was really quite impressed with. I forget his name now, but he was an Osho-san, one of the priests of the sub-temples right inside of Myoshinji. He was a very good practitioner. I was really impressed. Very impressed. And his son also, Hosan, he came and was one of Omori Sogen's students. I haven't heard or seen about him since, but hopefully, carrying on the tradition. So that just shows, even some of the very insightful priests in Myoshinji themselves were not very interested in that kind of approach and tradition.
Yeah. Please continue about Dudjom Rinpoche and your travels in Nepal.
Well, then I was even more fortunate, because one of the lamas that was, there were like 2 or 3 lamas that knew English quite well at that time, that would translate for Dudjom Rinpoche, because he, of course, didn't know any Tibetan, and I didn't know any English, and I didn't know any Tibetan at that point. And one of them was Tuko Pema Wangyal, who has been over in France for many, many years now, and has a big center and has done wonderful things there, and has a very good translation group. To diverge, if you want to read translations, there's a lot of good translations and there's a lot of less reliable translations, but his group is called the Padmakara Translation Group, Pemakara Translation Group, and those are his students who were, mostly students of Dudjom Rinpoche and Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche from Europe, and they've really done extremely wonderful job with translation, not just having the translations accurate, but accurately conveying the meaning as well. So pretty much anything that they've translated, I would highly recommend. And other persons that have done really good translation is my friend Eric Pema Kunzang, and another very good practitioner, Scottish fellow that unfortunately passed away a couple years ago. His name was Gyurme Dorji. He translated the history, Dudjom Rinpoche's history of the Nyingma.
Mm-hmm.
And also, my old friend Matthew Ricard. So I was very fortunate because I had met Tuko Pema Longyo while, he was translating for Dudjom Rinpoche and other times. And his English was very good. And one day he said to me, I said, I was thinking, I'd go back to Taiwan. He said, you might want to stay around for another while, because next week there's this really wonderful Lama that's coming to Boda also. And I think you'll enjoy meeting him. He said his name is Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. So I said, yeah, it's definitely, okay, I'll stay. So the Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche arrived. He was staying at Tuko Urgen Rinpoche's temple there in Boda. And so the day after Tuko Pema, he said, come on, I'll introduce you. So he took me over. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche was just sitting there in the Gumpa and talking with people. And he introduced me. I received a blessing. And then again, very different feeling from Dudjom Rinpoche. Dudjom Rinpoche is like completely, it's like meeting a completely transparent, being that's just operating at the speed of light. He's just unbelievably fast and unbelievably transparent. Even when he's speaking, it's like the words are just going right through you. And Khyentse Rinpoche is like this massive being, and he has this incredible sense of stability and groundedness and expansiveness, like this limitless mountain of, and very, 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 again, profound mental kind of blessing that went with that. I mean, I have to say that it's just like completely, it's like you've been completely drowned in an ocean of, his presence after you've been with someone like that for an hour or so. So then every day, I would go and see Khyentse Rinpoche in the morning. And then from that time, sometimes he'd be downstairs, sometimes he'd be upstairs. Anyway, there was like no restriction. You could just go in, sort of open the door. If the door were open, you could just peek through the curtain on the door, because the Tibetan doors always have a curtain on them, hanging on them, sort of peek in. And if there's a bunch of people in, you just sort of slowly, gently go in. I mean, if there's something really special going on, they'll tell you, or just sit in the corner, or they'll tell you, wait a minute, wait until Rinpoche starts, finishes with this person. But it wasn't like you weren't ever shooed away, So, and then you could just spend the whole day with Khyentse Rinpoche, basically. And then, if it was a day that Dudjom Rinpoche was having audience, I'd go and see if it was possible to see him at 4. Otherwise, I just spent the whole day with Khyentse Rinpoche. And even Khyentse Rinpoche would have lunch there. Everybody would be there. He'd have dinner there. Everybody would be there. He'd be chatting. He'd be laughing. He'd be chuckling. People would come in, request a teaching. People would come in. They'd request a wang. Whatever their initiation, whatever they're requesting, whatever he's giving, everyone can participate. If you're there, you're in. And, at that time, he wasn't he was very, very famous in the Tibetan community, but he wasn't so well known in the Western community. Apart from some of Tuko Pema's disciples, Tuko Pema Wangil's disciples from France and England that were there, pretty much no other Westerners were there. And I met Matthew. Matthew was already, he hadn't become a monk yet, but he was had been Kangyur Rinpoche's disciple. That was Tuko Pema Wangil's father. And then after Tuko Pema Wangil's father had passed away the year before, he became Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche's disciple. So he was there, and quite a bit of the time he was still going back and forth to France quite frequently, and still, I think, in the university. So anyway, that was like, how can you not pick up something? I mean, even a stone would start to learn Buddhism in those kind of conditions,
Yeah, I'm sure.
I was pretty hard-headed in a lot of ways, I have to admit. But even no matter how hard-headed I was, still would get through by. Wouldn't take more than about 5 minutes in that kind of presence. And then just being with Khyentse Rinpoche or Dudjom Rinpoche, then you would meet every other Tibetan Lama, because they would pretty much all come to meet them. And sometimes a little formally, and many times in a very informal way. So, you'd be sitting around, and then you could chat with, and I was learning a little Tibetan, and then you could chat with the other Tibetan Lamas. I mean, they're all famous Lamas and teachers nowadays. So pretty much every one of the Lamas that were, in their teens or 20s back then, they would all just be hanging around. Nobody would pay any special attention to them at all, and you could just, and they were always happy to chat with some Westerner or go have some chow mein or something with you for lunch at the little local restaurant for like, 35 cents, which was a lot back then. So it was very, very relaxed and kind of community atmosphere. And it was just all focused on either, Dudjom Rinpoche, if you were seeing him in his house, or Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And then one day I went to meet Chatral Rinpoche, and something amazing happened then. I was walking up the driveway to Dudjom Rinpoche's house, and he just had a very small kind of parking area in front of the house, and all the houses in Kathmandu, they have brick walls around them, and then they have a big metal double gate, that they can open so a car can come in or park in the outer entrance to the house. So, wow. I was just about to Dudjom Rinpoche's gate, and at Dudjom Rinpoche's house, everyone is like super polite, and because Rinpoche wasn't feeling well sometimes, everyone is trying to be very, very quiet, not raising your voice, most kind of respectful Buddhist kind of terms, and et cetera, et cetera. And then I was about 20 feet from the gate, and all of a sudden these metal doors fly open, bam, and they knocking against the brick posts, and making like two giant cymbals clashing, and then just walking out, and like striding out, like in a very forceful kind of way, is this Lama with a big, looks sort of white hair, very simple kind of dress, and one attendant sort of rushing after him with a bag and the car keys. And then he just strides out, walks right past me, and then got in this very rough Jeep, Indian Jeep, that's like the Indians, they used to make these Willys Jeeps that were, like the U.S. had from World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And got in this Jeep, revved up the diesel engine, rawr, 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 and then takes off down the road. And I said, wow, I never saw anything like that at Dudjom Rinpoche's before. So I got into the house downstairs, and I asked the attendant there, who is that? He said, that's Chatral Rinpoche. Chatral Rinpoche. So that was my first meeting with Chatral Rinpoche. And some people had told me before in Bodhanath, when I was there with Khyentse Rinpoche, have you ever met Chatral Rinpoche? He's like this other really unbelievable Lama in the Nyingma. I said, no. And I didn't really click. Like with Dudjom Rinpoche, I thought immediately, I got to go and see Dudjom Rinpoche right now. I didn't think that when they were talking about Chatral Rinpoche. I said, okay, yeah, okay. And then I saw Chatral Rinpoche, and I have to say, whoa! I thought, I don't know who this Lama is, but I don't think he's my teacher. Little did I know. So that was my first experience there. And that was definitely, the encapsulated essence of Chatral Rinpoche. He's like, a dynamic force unlike any other. He's like Yamaoka Teshu in action. Amazing. So then, but after, people were saying, you should meet Chatral Rinpoche, then I said, okay, well, I'll go and meet. So then actually one day he was staying in the house right next door to Dudjom Rinpoche, because one Tibetan businessman had a flat there, and he was a sponsor of a lot of the great lamas. So he invited, you could go, and he invited a lot of the great lamas to come and stay there, and especially Chatral Rinpoche. And so I went over there, I met him, it was not difficult to see him and anything. And then immediately I felt a very, very, very strong connection there. And the same thing, it's like Chatral Rinpoche, I had another kind of impression. It wasn't like whether he was saying this or that seemed so important, but, his mind presence was just overwhelmingly powerful. Another, just unbelievably powerful presence. So then I started to see Chatral Rinpoche very frequently. I connected with him, and I started to just not specifically follow any teaching that he was giving or something, but just try to emulate his presence. And I think that's actually the basis of any kind of Guru Yoga. If you can just emulate the being of that master, right, and just let that pour through more and more, right, and just try to maintain that at every moment of the day. I think that's, for me, that was a way easier way of practicing than reading some texts and sadhanas and trying to approach it that way.
Yeah. I can completely relate to that, because that's how it was for me also. I practiced Zen Buddhism for a number of years with really wonderful teachers, including Terayama Sensei. But then something really shifted for me when I learned about Tantric Guru Yoga. So it was like wow, this is easy, So yeah, that was great. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't need to learn anything. You don't need to know any languages, really. I mean, it's nice if you can converse with those people and they're right in front of you, right? So that part is good. But actually, that's not the key.
Yeah.
You know, reading lots of texts, studying lots of texts, you know, occasionally to open a book and then you can read a few paragraphs, that can be very helpful. But just reading and reading and reading, maybe not quite so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I like about your approach, because you know, you're one of the few Westerners that really emphasizes that, as opposed to kind of a progression of, you know, you have to do all these different steps, right? Would you like to say something about that?
About Guru Yoga specifically, or
not, you know, that just going for the key essence there, rather than just you know, being how do you say, checking off all these progressive steps of practice on the path, right? That's the usual way of things.
Yeah, sure. Well, um, what should I say? It's well, I started my formal practice with Zen Buddhism, and just like you know, in Japanese Buddhism, they talk about one's own power, jiriki, and other power practice, tariki. So you know, I practiced a lot with Zen Buddhist practice, put in quite a bit of sitting, and was following the instructions that I got verbatim, really to the letter, day and night. And finally, I felt that, okay, this is, you know, I don't have, you know, I'm not strong enough to practice like this. And then I learned about Tantra and Guru Yoga, and it just felt like a completely different world in my mind, completely different experience open for me. And literally from the first tantric session that I did, Guru Yoga session, I didn't drop. You know, when I felt that connection with a past master, already master who had passed away, you know, it was so simple and so direct. And, you know, direct is a really good, because, you know, I didn't have to generate anything. I only needed to connect and feel. And immediately there was recognition. So, you know, I kept in that, like it's taught in Tantra, that there is external aspect, internal aspect, and secret aspect with all practices. So I always kept the external practice really simple. I always used perhaps only just the name of the master, of the guru, and just repeated that enough to access the internal aspect, to connect, and then just be open and receptive. And you know, and then little by little doing that, when I started doing it, I kept doing it 2-3 years, day and night. Like I didn't drop it at all for a couple of years. And then little by little, I started to understand that secret aspect of tantric practice, which is pristine awareness, natural state itself. So yeah, that having had that experience of like self-power practice, generating all the energy and using a lot of concentration, that didn't work for me that well. You know, it was very easy for me to shift to tantric practice, because it was so much easier for me, much better fit.
Yeah, once you see, you know, once you really come face to face, when I came face to face, like with Dudjom Rinpoche or Chatral Rinpoche or the 16th Karmapa or, you know, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, then, you know, just in that presence, all my previous kind of energy practices, whether they were from Kendo or Zen practice or Tai Chi or martial arts practices, that all just looked like a kind of tinker toys. It wasn't that, it wasn't that, of course it's good, but compared to what these teachers were manifesting, it's a very, very small aspect.
And there's also in relation to that self-generation type of practice, there's always also the matter of if you practice really, really a lot, if you really go do a lot of in a hard way those practices, that there's a question of health or illnesses, that it just uses a lot of prana, a lot of chi, and this can cause illness. Like it's often the case, Yamaka Teshu died of stomach cancer at 52, 53 years old, and also Terayama Sensei, he passed of stomach cancer at 68. So
yeah, he wasn't that old because he looked quite youthful. Anyway, he looked younger than his years, but I was really shocked when I heard that he'd already passed away.
Yeah, so often like stomach and kidney problems because of so much effort. But yeah,
I did some retreats in Nepal in the beginning, and I did kind of formal retreats with a lot of mantra recitation and everything, and I noticed that sometimes at the end of the day, you're just like completely, I felt exhausted.
Yeah. But then, like, my experience has been that, like you said, in reference to all the Rinpoches that you studied, that the charge was really strong, that you only needed to be there for an hour and you would be like a kind of like a container that has been filled with something.
Yeah,
like you would be full. But my experience about that is that even if you practice some deities or practice Guru Yoga, and even if you become full, it doesn't, that tiredness or exhaustion from that it's different kind. It kind of it doesn't feel like it does anything harmful, if that makes sense.
Oh, you mean then you're not affected by this tiredness so much?
I mean that that the energy that the tantric practice generates, that it, even if it's too much for the body, it doesn't start breaking the body.
Oh no, yeah. I agree. Yeah. I agree. Yeah, sometimes you could just be with like Khyentse Rinpoche like for 3 minutes and you'll feel that. It doesn't take an hour, it just almost. And sometimes, I saw a couple of times with some great Lama, you just bow. So the Tibetans are always bowing, and they're always giving, the Lamas are always giving a little blessing with their hand or their mala or something like that. Sometimes, with a really great Lama, even if they're just going by on the path and you bow down and they give a blessing like that, in one split second, you can feel that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can be, they can do more in, half a second than most can do, in weeks. So
I remember I have a really good story about that. That was the first time when I met His Holiness the Dalai Lama back in 2006 when he was visiting Helsinki. And he gave a talk in this opera house. And after that, immediately after that, I went behind the building where the limousines, the cars were waiting to take him away. And I took a place in the line of people where, His Holiness, he came from the door, and people were giving him scarves, katas, and like this. And I had this wrist mala with me, and I took the mala out of my wrist and held it on my hand like this, showing it to him. And he came in front of me, and he noticed the mala and just blew on it like this, and walked by. And I took the mala, put it on my wrist, and I was like in a completely different state of mind for two days after that. That was beautiful. Just one blow.
Yeah, that's all it takes. Well, I don't know. We've been chatting for quite a while. What do you think if we, if you want to chat again later, we can definitely do that another time. If you feel it's, useful or helpful, or if you'd enjoy. And
yes, I realized that we've been at it for quite a while. So we have two options. We can either continue this at other time, or would you like to continue and just take a break for 10 minutes, perhaps?
I think it's good we do another time.
Okay.
So
okay.
I'm.
Sure.
Maybe if we do in next week or a few days, whenever it's convenient for you.
Okay.
We can resume. Just make a bookmark. Know what our last.
Sure.
But I just want to say to your students and to you, I'm quite gratified to see the kind of teachings that you're giving. I do think those teachings are very, very effective, and a lot of the kind of, maybe it's just because a lot of the teachings that you enjoy are also the kind that I'm, teaching people, and I seem to find effective for interacting with students. But I really think your approach is, very good. And next time I'll say a little more about Pemaku also, because quite surprising that you came to that term and that name, but that's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And, that was also like where the present, or just the last Dudjom Rinpoche was born. And a lot of his tradition is surviving today, both on the Tibetan side, and the lower part of Pemaku extends down into Arunachal Pradesh in India. So that's still extant today. And one of the lamas that I know very well, because he's in Santa Barbara, California, where I stay sometimes, he is the one that's sort of taken over that center there, and he has a retreat center there, and he's sort of developing it a little bit. So I could say a little more about that in the future too. I never visited there, but several of my friends have. So I think that's also very, very special place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Lama John, for this interview. It was fantastic to listen to your stories from childhood, and then to Japan, and then to Tibet. And thank you for those kind words about my work. I appreciate highly them coming from you. And let's continue perhaps in a week or two.
Yeah. And next time we'll have more of a conversation and less of a monologue from me.
But it's a really good monologue, because you have such a long history with, and all these great lamas, the kind of the last generation who came from Tibet, who trained in Tibet. So I really love hearing those stories.
Yeah, very, very fortunate. I mean, at that time, if you were over in Kathmandu or in some places in India, it was just like, such abundance of riches in terms of, realized masters over there. I mean, those are like, there were like a dozen lamas, in the Nyingma tradition alone that were like really extremely high level masters.
Yeah.
So, okay, we can talk more about that. Thank you very much. And, don't be discouraged. I know you're talking sometimes about how people are giving you a lot of difficulty because they said you're not recognized by this or that, or how did you have this kind of insight or whatever. But take it all with a grain of salt. And we can talk more next time about your Bhumi system and analysis. So it'd be interesting to hear more about that and have some conversation about that also. But I think it's generally great. I think it's great. But as I said in my little humorous comment there, it's also quite threatening to the income of some of the people involved. So,
it is. Yeah.
So they're worried, if this gets out in Taiwan, well, sales could plummet. So
right. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks again, John, and talk to you later. Have a nice day.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.